Welcome to Books and Beverages for April. I think you all know about Books and Beverages now. I recognise many people in the audience. I think you have been here before, and we're very pleased to welcome you again, but we're also very pleased to see new people discovering what we do. Our aim really is to introduce new authors, local authors, give people an opportunity to talk about their writing and their latest books. We try and change the genre each time so that you get something different. It's not always crime, it's not always romance, we do different things as much as we can. So you're very welcome, and we hope you'll come again and again. Today we're very fortunate. We have Vincent Formosa with us, and Vincent is going to tell us about his books, which are a rather different genre again. So I'm going to ask him to read a passage from a book to give you a flavour of what he writes and how he writes it. And then we'll have a discussion between us. And if you have questions, I'm sure Vincent will be happy to answer those too. Welcome, Vincent.
Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for coming this afternoon and taking time out from your day. So what I'm going to read from is a short piece from my latest book, Demons in the Dark, which came out in about August last year. This is set around the time of the Blitz. It follows the introduction of the early radar for the RAF, and this piece here is about 2/3 of the way through. The main character is on the mat. He's in trouble because they weren't supposed to fly their aircraft with the radar sets beyond the bounds of the coastline because the sets were too secret. They didn't want the Germans getting their hands on one, and he did. So he's in trouble. So that's the piece I'm going to read here. Okay, so McLaren didn't wait for morning to have them both on the mat. He'd already had Group and the duty controller bending his ear for the last hour. He took Khan for a walk after that to calm down. The sky was starting to lighten when they were wheeled into his office. He dismissed Billings after hearing the story from both of them. Billings hadn't been flying. Short of pulling a gun on Christopher, there wasn't much else he could have done to stop him. McLaren lost his cool as soon as the radar operator left the room. "What the hell were you playing at?" McLaren asked, his voice loud in his small office, deliberately so. Leslie stood behind him, his hands behind his back. He had a grandstand seat for this little tableau, but he wished he was anywhere else but here. McLaren thumped the desk hard. The corgi jumped in surprise, and then it bared its teeth and growled from under the desk. McLaren ruffled its ears, making shushing sounds to calm it down. "Didn't you hear Control calling you back?" he asked, his voice a little more level. "Must have been a radio fault, sir," Christopher said innocently. McLaren looked at him askance. Claiming a radio fault was just about the oldest trick in the book. War was a serious business. There wasn't any room for those kinds of japes anymore. You've got to fight the Germans on your own and keep on going until there are none left, yes? Yes? Christopher just nodded. He'd learned a long time ago that the less you said, the less trouble you made for yourself. "I don't want to die. I'm sure Billings doesn't. It's a shame you're in such a hurry to," McLaren said, more a statement than a question. "It's not that, sir," Christopher protested. "I think it is. I think if you went down in a blaze of glory, you would consider it worthwhile, a meaningful sacrifice." Leslie watched in silence as this battle of wills played out. It wasn't really a battle, though. Squadron leaders tended to trump NCOs every time. "Up until now, I've indulged your thirst for revenge. Too much, it seems. This flight needs to produce results, to test out new equipment, but not at the risk of losing the whole bloody war. The Germans aren't stupid. They must know something's going on. They may have guessed, but what do you think would happen if we gift them a radar set?" McLaren bit his lip, trying to control himself. "By rights, I should either ground you, or court-martial you, or something else. Probably all of it." That produced a reaction. Christopher shook. He flinched like he'd been physically slapped. Yes, Group wants your backside on a hook, McLaren affirmed. They wanted you hung, drawn and quartered. I had to take personal responsibility for you. I'm sorry, sir, Christopher said, as the CO looked at him through narrowed eyes. I'm sorry, sir, McLaren said, mimicking his voice with a lilting curl. My God! He glanced at Leslie. My God, he's sorry. He thumped the desk again. There's more at stake here than just you. He let the silence drag while he considered what to do. McLaren didn't think it was just revenge either. This thing with Cunningham in the papers was pushing all of them to achieve, to work harder. This myth about carrots stung their pride. Obviously, this drive to get kills was starting to cloud the lad's judgment. He couldn't ground Christopher, and he was damned if he was going to court-martial him. But that didn't stop him from doing something to save his life. He smiled, and Christopher wondered what that meant. This is it. I'm being posted, he thought. He'd brought it upon himself, but it didn't stop him from offering up a silent prayer for God to get him out of this. I won't ground you, McLaren said finally, but I've got something here that's right up your street. You're a defiant man. That experience should come in handy. He checked his wristwatch. Be back here at 10 with your gear. In the meantime, you're confined to quarters. Now get out of my sight. After he closed the door behind him, McLaren stared out of his office window as the sun loomed over the horizon. Leslie didn't leave immediately, and McLaren glanced at the adjutant, waiting for him to ask his question. Why didn't you post him, sir? Or better yet, force him to take some leave? McLaren snorted and drank some tea. He felt like something stronger, but he wanted to save it for later to help him sleep. I couldn't do that. He shook his head. You've seen what he's like. Imagine you were him. Would you go on leave? He's far beyond that point now. And if we rest him, he'd either kill himself or do something daft. We can't afford to lose someone so experienced, even if they are a pain in the backside. I'm overdue. So is Manders and most of the others, he said. We just got to keep going. We've got to beat Hitler and his whole rotten shower. It's the only decent thing to do. That sounds very British, Leslie commented. Decent is a peacetime word. Perhaps it is, McLaren agreed. But if we lose that part of ourselves that makes this so important. We're all fighting our own demons, doing what we need to get through the day. I can't fault him for that. It's decency that we need to preserve, a small part of mercy, while young men destroy themselves. Leslie left McLaren then, thinking about what he had said.
You bring those characters very much to life, don't you? And also the situation that they're in. But why did you choose to write about fighter pilots in World War II?
Well, I'd started writing fiction about 20 years ago, and I started doing little snippets of science fiction, and I was in a very active fan forum associated with a particular TV show. And it was okay, you were writing little extensions to scenes or alternate endings to episodes and stuff that you'd seen. And I sort of reached the point, it's like, well, this is all copyrighted stuff. This is not my own material, it's never going to get published. So at that point, I then stepped sideways and started thinking, well, what should I write about? Well, I know about flying because I'd been in the Air Cadets. I wanted to be in the RAF. I knew about military history. Let's give that a go. And it all went from there.
So that's where your ideas have come from. Because I have looked at several of your books, and there is a similarity, but there is a great difference amongst them too. So how do you pull those ideas together?
The first thing I suppose when I do each book in turn is I sort of settle on a particular aircraft that I'm interested in, because you've got to be interested in something to write about it. So Maximum Effort is about bomber command, Prototype is about the introduction of the first jets into RAF service, things like. So it's something that grabs my interest, and from there I then I will start doing the reading on that and see, is there a story there? Is there something either that they did operationally or a particular time period that captures that, and then that's when I can then drill into that and decide what's possible from a fiction standpoint.
So there's a lot of research in it too. There's a lot of researching the The incident, or the plane, or
Well, a bit of both. I mean, when I did my second book, the Bristol Blenheim, there's only one flying in the world, and it had just recently been restored for the third time after they'd crashed it on 2 other occasions, and they were good enough to actually review the manuscript from a technical standpoint to see that I'd got everything about the aircraft actually right, and it was quite good because when I went down to see them, you know, there we were at an air show, and there's this barrier, you know, that you don't go beyond because you're on the crowd, and the guy spots me and goes, "Oh yeah, Vin, come here." So I hop over the barrier, and I do about the 30 yards over to where the Blenheim is, and he proceeds to give me this tour. "Oh, do you want to go in the cockpit?" "Yes, please." You know, and you know, and I'm getting daggers from the crowd behind me. You know, so those are my little treats as well. But sometimes it's the research about the aircraft because it may be something I'm not as familiar with. Because let's face it, we all know about, you know, like Spitfires and Hurricanes and things like that. But some of the more obscure types, you need to know about. Like, for example, when I was writing Prototype, there was not a tremendous amount of stuff about the very early service of the Meteor jet at the end of the war. And then I posted on a Facebook group, "Oh, you know, does anybody know of any books they can recommend?" And this guy contacts me and goes, "Oh, well, my dad was one of the ground crew, and he wrote a little bit of a memoir thing. Are you interested?" Yes. He sends it over, and it's like it's about 80 odd pages, but it was filled with all the little bits that help craft the world and make the detail feel more real. So, like, you know, some of the technical quirks, which are never in any of the books I had read. So, but those are the little things that help, you know, make it much more grounded. So, you know, similarly with Maximum Effort, someone was good enough to send, because if you want to get a lot of the official paperwork, you have to go down to the National Archives at Kew Gardens, which is fine. I was quite prepared to do it. But the guy goes, "Oh, well, I've already got the stuff all scanned." So he sent me through the night raid reports from the period that the novel was set in. So I had all the material I needed to do it, you know. But yeah, lot of reading.
Yeah, I can tell that. Yes, and some of those things, yes, there's a lot of time and effort in getting those kind of details together, whether you're reading, whether you're travelling to somewhere or whatever. But you've got some very interesting characters in your books too, haven't you? And they're all a little bit, a little bit cocky, a little bit full of themselves, a little bit, yeah. Don't necessarily want to toe the line.
They're pilots.
Well, explain pilots to us then.
Well, I mean, to give an example, I mean, you look at one of my books, the second book, Run the Gauntlet. That was pretty much inspired by an article I had read where the Blenheim is a light bomber. It has a 3-man crew, and it was about 18, 20 aircraft on a squadron. So if you think at the beginning of the war, you've got a bunch of guys who've known each other for a long time, you know, live hard, play hard, all that stuff. And in the article, it went on about how this particular squadron, in the first 10 days of the fall of France, we're talking from the 10th to the 20th of May, they lost 18 out of 21 squadrons, 21 crews. So you think about it, I mean, on one day, 8 crews didn't come back. So, you know, they were up for breakfast, and then by tea time, 20-odd guys were either dead or prisoners. So, you know, and then you see it portrayed in film, and obviously when I read a lot of the first-hand accounts, yeah, they were cocky sods, but that's because they weren't necessarily going to be here tomorrow. So, you know, yeah, they get up to all sorts.
Yes, they do. So, are any of these characters based on people that you've known, or are they all out of your imagination?
Plead the fifth. No, it's like anything. It's an amalgam. There's lots of me in quite a few of them. Certain quirks, like I was saying to you before we started, with Calico, it's set in the Pacific. The character goes to sea for the first time and discovers he's not a very good sailor. Neither am I. You know, and they do say write about what you know. So I could write with very good first-hand knowledge of what it's like to be seasick. So why not make use of that? But as regards to the other stuff, yeah, it's all shades of grey. I don't think anyone could ever point at any one character and say, "Ooh, that's me. I don't like that." But by the same token, there's bits all over the place. I'm not naming names, but there's a lot of things. Yeah, that because again, like I said, you write about what you know. If I've had that experience or seen it happen to somebody else, or someone talks in a particular way, this is it. I'm a sponge. I'm this giant sponge that's just constantly absorbing stuff and filing it away, because I might not use it today, but then later on in another book, a particular character might, suddenly pop into my head, and it's like, oh yeah, perfect. I know exactly what I'm doing here, and that's it. And you've suddenly got this whole fully fleshed out, rounded character in your head because you're using something that you're already familiar with.
You're obviously also writing about a time, the 1940s, a time that you've not lived in.
No.
No. So what about your research around those sort of things? How and where do you do that?
A lot of things. I mean, obviously, first off, we've got all of the official accounts, which are things to do with the official squadron records and stuff, because that gets me my baseline for what went on. Then thankfully, over the years, there's been a lot of historical authors who do good research, gathering first-hand accounts of actual pilots and crews and everything who are actually involved in this stuff. And that's when it starts getting interesting, because sometimes their recollection doesn't necessarily jibe with the official records. And now you're into the realms of which version do I prefer. But then that, as I say, that gets you the little anecdotal bits and pieces that you can help use to build it up. But then on the top of that is I actually rely a lot on film. And when I mean that, it's like, because obviously I'm quite sure the audience, growing up, Sunday, there was always a black and white war film on TV and there wasn't anything else to watch. So that was it. But what I realized a number of years ago is if you look at like a lot of the British war films from the late 40s, 50s onwards, all of the guys who were in those had been in the war. So the way that they actually comport themselves and the way they talk and the way they salute and all the rest of it is how it would have been, like Richard Todd was in the army. A couple of Carry-On actors were involved with the escape of the wooden horse from one of the prisoner of war camps, and things like that. So you look at this, but also it's a way to get into cadence and speech, because obviously how we talk today bears probably not a great deal of resemblance to 80 or 90 years ago, but of course 40s to 50s, how they talk, how they present, how they whatever. It is basically, again, so this is where the giant sponge bit comes in, and I will watch these things on repeat because I want to absorb that, because I want to try and replicate as much as I can the speech patterns and obviously the way that people behave, because also different standards now, what we find acceptable, and certain things are a bit taboo then that are less so now, and you've got to sort of tap into that. Again, it's all part of the world building to build that setting for you, the reader, to actually accept it.
So how long does it take you then from your idea to writing the finished, or getting to the finished book?
Well, depends. I mean, when I first started, the first couple of books took about 18 months apiece, and it's partly due to the fact that you're figuring out how to do it, because you've got to finish the first draft, then you've got to edit it, then you've got to go back in and change stuff, and then you've got to do all the checks. So that, you haven't got your processes down, that takes time. Conversely, my third book, Maximum Effort, the first 35,000 words were written in about a week, because I had seen this photograph it was one of these sort of photo shoots they do now, where reenactors turn up at museums and they pose in front of the aircraft, and there was this photograph of a Lancaster wreathed in smoke, backlit, and there were 7 guys dressed in the flying gear in the front, and they were wrapped in the smoke. So there was that ever so slightly sort of ghostly element to it, because obviously Bomber Command had a lot of casualties, but and it was just a very emotive photograph. And I contact him and say, oh yeah, I'd really like to use that as the cover for the book, please. And he was like, yeah, sure, no problem. But from that, boom, right, I know it's going to be. It's going to be about this guy, and he's coming back, and he's getting a new crew, and all, and it just suddenly popped into my head, like instantly formed, and I was off and running. Then I sort of hit a brick wall for a bit, because after 35,000 words, I hadn't figured out what happened next. But then that's when the research kicked in, Now, with some of the later books, during COVID, I wrote 2 during lockdown and edited a 3rd. And some of the newer ones now, 5 months was, I think the record was 5 months from start to finish, physically, boom, out on the shelf. But that's a lot more now to do with the editing process at the back. The writing bit tends to take about the same amount of time, and then it's the editing that's gotten easier.
So do you just sit down at 9 o'clock each morning and write?
Sometimes. Well, thankfully, I do some working from home, and the wife's at work, kids are at school. So, I get a nice uninterrupted 6 or 7 hours to really hit it. And, I could have a 10,000 word day, which is a lot. This partly comes into the way that I now do it. But, sometimes I used to agonize at the page, willing the words to come. And it would be like the full day goes by and I've done practically nothing. But now it's much easier. But yeah, if I can get a nice quiet few hours, yeah. I'm more of a day person than an evening person when it comes to writing.
And what about other authors who write war fiction? Who are your favourites?
Douglas Reman does World War II naval fiction. He also writes as Alexander Kent. He does Napoleonic naval. It's one and the same. Frederick E. Smith, who did the 633 Squadron books. Derek Robinson, who's done a sort of more of a modern pastiche of that. Elliston Trevor is another super author. He only did a couple of war stories, but it actually served in the RAF. So obviously first-hand accounts. So again, as much as it's fiction, I do tend to reread him quite a bit, because again, it goes back to the way they talk, the way they act, the way things are, to sort of soak up that atmosphere. And I very much sort of try to get in that vein. I have been compared to Len Deaton, which was quite nice. I'll take that comparison, thank you. Somebody else and a couple of reviews a few times have compared it to the books, the 633 Squadron books, which I was surprised to find there was actually 10, not just the one that they made into a film. But again, I'll take that, because that's the style that I'm aiming for. That's the kind of reader that I want. So, to actually be compared was quite good, yeah.
And so when you're writing and you're back in the 1940s, do you kind of feel as if you are living it, as if you are actually within there?
Yeah, sometimes. I have to be careful, because obviously growing up, we had Commando comics, Victor, Valiant, Hotspur and all that. And as much as I like to read those, and I've still got some, I sort of have to be rather strict with myself and not read this stuff once I'm actually writing. Because otherwise I did it once in one of my very early books. I had this great character and he was called this and he did that and described him. And then it turned out I'd totally pinched this from something else, including the character name, the whole thing. So I was like, oh God, So I have to be careful, as much as I sort of like live it and breathe it. I do have to sometimes just take that step back, because it's, this is going to be my idea. It's not going to be something else that I've subliminally absorbed from all of the research.
So what are you working on at the moment?
Well, the latest one, book number 10, I never thought I'd get that far, is going to be about the Westland Whirlwind, which is a very little known aircraft in the RAF service. Unfairly so. It sort of has a reputation which, from the more I read, definitely wasn't deserved. But basically, officialdom didn't want it. And they only ever had 2 squadrons in service. So I've sort of took that idea and played with it a bit and thought, right, well, what if they just made a few more? and there was enough for there to be a third squadron. That's my guys. They're going to be the third squadron that gets formed, and we follow what goes on all the way through to the landing at Dieppe, which was a bit of a disaster, but that's going to be the big climax at the end. So that covers back end of 1941 through to about August 1942.
And you always concentrate on a particular aircraft when you're building your teams and your stories. So do you find a huge difference between the squadrons, between the people who are actually flying these different aircraft?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's rivalry, there's all the mine's better than yours type stuff. And in fact, occasionally in some of the books, we have one where, like, say, a guy gets lost, sets down at the airfield, and it's very much, I say, am I okay for tea? And they all sort of like start gathering around what he's come in, and they start pointing out the deficiencies and, oh, it looks like a sewing machine and all this sort of thing. And there's all that. So, there's probably less of it than perhaps there was, but that's because, squadrons tended to be very sort of self-contained, and, they all go out together as a group and all that. And so I'm short of them bumping into another bunch down at the pub. There's less of that, but that's what a lot of the things I do try to build into the books, is that level of detail where some of the quirks and sometimes the deadly quirks are very much in evidence, because again, I'm trying to give you the sort of taste of what the day-to-day was like. As much as a lot of World War II books sort of concentrate on them all training for this one big operation and special mission and things like that, mine tend not to be. I sort of focus on the day-to-day, and we cover a block of time. So like Maximum Effort was about this cruise tour of operations. Strike from the Sea follows our guy getting posted into a unit, and it follows him all the way through to the end of the war. So it's less about a specific special mission. It's more about the day-to-day stresses and psychological impact of what that must have been like.
Yes, and obviously some of them do come down and some of them are captured. So how are you building your stories around that? How are you doing your research around the ones that don't come back immediately?
Well, it's just pretty brutal, actually. A lot of the books, as it happens, involve low-level attacks, and you can't bail out that low, so you either crash land or you get killed. So I think the big thing with mine is nobody's safe from a character standpoint, and because I do think, as much as there is acts of bravery, war in and of itself is not glorious. And I think that part of what I need to sort of bring through to the reader is it was like that. And this is it, sometimes I'll have characters take off and half of them don't come back. And you've just spent half the book getting to know these guys, and then he's gone, he's dead, he's a prisoner, because this is what it would be like. And I think by doing it that way, it does have more impact for the reader, because you've sort of grown attached to these guys, and then I'm starting to cull them left, right, and centre. I'm particularly in Run the Gauntlet, because they start off in France before the war really kicked off. So we spend about 2/3 of the book seeing what they get up to while the phony war is going on, and hijinks down the pub, and they meet some local girls and all this. And then when the action kicks in, is like that magazine article I read. Suddenly it's like, death for breakfast, lunch, and supper. So yeah, I can be pretty brutal when it comes to characters, but I think it gives it that edge.
So do you think you can go on and on writing books about World War II and fighter pilots, because 10's fairly impressive, and
I've got about another 7 already plotted out, and very much they're a case of almost like 2 or 3 sentences, a sort of possible title, what the plane would be, and the setting. But I have sort of branched out a little bit, because I've plotted out a sequel to Calico, which is about the Fleet Air Arm, which is in Korea. Some of the same characters on the same ship 5 years later, which obviously was a totally different war. And obviously everyone these days tends to remember Korea as an American thing, but for the first year, everybody else was involved. One with the French resistance, one in Ethiopia against the Italians, which is a really obscure theatre, which I'm going to have to do some reading on, but it gives me a lot more room to muck about with the plot, because everybody knows very little about that, so I've got a lot more liberty to mess about with things. I don't think I'm going to run out of ideas anytime soon. It's just finding the time to actually get them down on paper.
And you are self-publishing at the moment, aren't you?
Yeah.
Would you like to explain why you went that route?
About 15 years ago, when I'd finished the first book, I'd gotten some rejection letters, and I was aiming to get the whole set so I could sort of wallpaper one wall, And I was reading a blog from an author, a crime author called Joe Conrath, and he had an interesting hook. His main character is a female detective called Jacqueline Daniels, that everybody called Jack Daniels. And the titles of all of his books are cocktails. So it ties in with the whole Jack Daniels thing, and like whiskey sour and things like that. And he was banging on about how self-publishing was the way to go and all this, because e-books 15 years ago were obviously not as common as they are now. And he was saying how, unless you're the next Dan Brown, you will get absolutely no promotion from your publisher whatsoever. You've got to develop yourself as an author, you've got to develop your audience. So ultimately what you're doing is you might get a 10 or a 15% royalty as an author to a main publisher. And for that privilege, you're going to get your book on the shelf at Borders or whatever. Yeah. And it's still going to be you who's going to have to go out and generate interest and build that readership. So you're giving away 85-90% of your royalty for that. Yeah. And he said, I'll tell you what I want to do. I'm going to do this because if I do it on Amazon, I get 60% of all the ebooks and I get like whatever percentage for the book. So I'm still going to have to do all the legwork to develop my readership, but I'm going to get the reward for that. And I thought, you know what? Actually, it's worth a try, because I'm clearly not doing much here, because obviously if you think about it, if I'm writing in the style of Douglas Freeman mainly wrote in the 70s and the 80s, So are they going to look at that and think, well, World War II fiction, it's a bit niche, that it's not really going to get us anything. Why not try it? And so I did, and then lockdown came along and did really well. Suddenly everybody was at home reading books. So at that point, I had got 3 out, then 4, then 5 very quickly, and it just went whoosh and took off, and here I am.
Yes, I think a lot of people feel that if you can do this for yourself and not be losing your income, then it's a lot better, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it's not enough to pack the day job in, but it's not bad. Yeah.
No, it's good. Have the audience got any questions? Anything you'd like to ask, Vince?
Yes. Do you visit the places that you're talking about?
So, a lot of the time, yes. I mean, obviously, most of the stories are set primarily in the UK. So I do some visits to some of the airfields and stuff. Obviously, like, say, Bomber Command was primarily based in Lincoln. So I've been down there, and I've been to Grantham, which is with the headquarters for 5 Group. And I've been to other places down in Kent as well. Obviously, some of the places are a little bit more exotic. Like, I've not been to the Pacific, so I had to rely on source material for that. But yeah, I mean, it ties in, like I say, with writing about what you know. Demons in the Dark was quite personal because where a lot of the story was set, that's where my grandparents lived, down in Kingston. So I would go down there in the summer. So when I'm writing about this stuff, I actually know. I know what that street was like, and I know what that was like. So again, it comes back to lending authenticity to the thing. I mean, for example, when I said the guy said, "Oh yeah, come over here, have a sit in the cockpit of the Blenheim." I'm glad I did, because when I had written the book, I talked about how the pilot was in the cockpit and he was looking around, and I suddenly discovered that when you were in there, you couldn't actually see very much to the sides because the engines were in the way. And that's not written down anywhere, but obviously having actually been and sat in the thing, I suddenly realised actually, yeah, so I had to go back and do quite a bit of rewriting then about, actually it's the gunner that sees it rather than the pilot, because there's no way the pilot could have seen it. I think it's important because, I mean, research will get you so far, looking at a picture will get you so far, but if you can get to these places and actually see them, you know, you're going to absorb. You know, there's the whole atmosphere to the place and things like that. And again, that comes back to helping you as an author set the scene for the reader, you know, and describe it. You know. Yeah.
The question was, as we move further away from the Second World War, does Vince think the interest is dropping off?
That's a really good question, actually. All I can say is when I look at the, I get I do Facebook ads for the books, and when I get the sort of the monthly figures, I get the breakdown of age dynamics of who's clicked through on the ad to the books, and it's generally 40 plus. You know, very, very few on the younger ones, and the older you get, the more interest there is. So I've got a dying audience, I suppose. I don't know. I mean, it comes in fits and starts, isn't it? I mean, you think, I suppose interest in World War II was waning, but then Christopher Nolan did the film Dunkirk. And then all of a sudden there was renewed interest, and in fact, actually, for some reason, that film did really well with female audiences. I don't know why. But then there was 1917, which again renewed a bit more interest in World War I. We had obviously the 100th anniversary of the First World War a few years ago. There's a whole slew of 80th, 85th anniversaries coming up. You've got that with Britain, V-Day, and all that sort of stuff. So they always come around, and then you'll get spikes of interest in particular things. So I don't think it'll ever die out. I just think it'll probably reach a level that's probably just consistently low. It's probably the way it'll end up, because there'll be more recent events that garner attention. But there's always going to be that interest, I think.
Yeah. I was just wondering, because you mentioned Len Dayton, and he did a lot of fiction, but then he moved over into non-fiction as well, really, with historical sort of non-fiction. Because of the research you do, is that something you're tempted to evolve with?
The question is, would Vince be tempted to move into non-fiction as other writers like Len Dayton have done?
I'll think about that for a second. Possibly. The thing is I think the difficulty now lies for a historical writer, particularly for World War II, is my interest would lie primarily compiling books which are telling the story about, say, a particular unit. And within that, you're going to want to include as many first-hand accounts as you can get. Problem is now is there's very few veterans left. I think, well, in fact, it was in the news last week, the very last survivor of the few died. Is 105. So, you know, when you look at it, you think, right, if these guys were in their 20s in 1940, you know, A, are they still alive? B, am I going to get a coherent account anyway, because of their advanced age now? And you know, it would be very difficult. So I'd be reduced to referring to second-hand stuff. Now, to be fair, it's not entirely dead as a concept, because when I went down to Duxford, they have regular air shows, and all the book stalls are there. And I was kicking myself. There was a folder of stuff. It was all paperwork. And what it was it was one of the really well-known authors of the 70s and the 80s who would do lots of books about different types of aircraft. And of course, in them days, you would get all the source material from the veterans about what it was like. And those first-hand accounts end up in the book. The folder was a stack like this of all first-hand handwritten material that he has got from these veterans. And obviously not all of it gets in the book. So there was probably a lot of stuff there that's never been read, it's never been heard of, and this is all wonderful first-hand account material. So I didn't buy it. They wanted too much money. I think nowadays it's the kind of thing I would bite hands off, because even if it's not about the aircraft I'm interested in, there's going to be bits in there that I can make use of for fiction, but then there's a grounding there for me to maybe make something of later, because if it's never been used, that's wonderful, because there is a readership out there that's always looking for something new that's not been seen before, it's not been regurgitated from another book. You know, give me something fresh. So, yeah, I think it would just have to, I'd have to find the right thing, I think. You know, it's going to have to grab me, because I'm not just going to write for the sake of writing. I've got to have that interest to drive me to actually finish it, yeah.
Yes.
How do you get into the mind of someone who might be dead by dinner time? And what I mean by that is, like, there's that sort of cliche of live fast, die young, let's make the most of the day. I think I'm always amazed that people got into those plays. Because the ways of dying are so varied,
Yeah.
and it's so likely.
Yeah. It's interesting, because I mean, the thing with my books is, as much as at the top level, there's this story about what's going on and the war and all the rest of it. A lot of it drills down into the mindset, because if I deal with your question by talking about maximum effort, I decided to make the story about a guy who had finished one tour on bombers, had had 6 months rest, and was getting told he was going to have to go back for a second tour. And by the way, you're going to get a rookie crew who don't know, you know. And what I found with reading about the bomber crews is actually ignorance was bliss, because a lot of the stuff that would go wrong on the bomber missions, they didn't know. And then by the end, because if you think of, I think it was about 5 in 100 crews finished a tour, and then you'd have 6 months off, and then you go and do it again. The first time out, you're sort of learning the ropes, and until you get halfway through the tour, you haven't quite figured it out yet, and then towards the end, you just want to get to the end. And for me, it was the whole, what would it be like to go back for the second time, because you ain't ignorant anymore, you know what's coming, and it's how do you deal with that psychologically, to drag yourself out of bed every day and go and do this. Particularly when you've got a bunch of guys who don't know any better and are all, oh gee, yeah, we're going to give the Hun 6 of the best, and he's like, yeah, you know, heard this. So that whole thing was a really big thing about, well, duty, because this is it. There's different drivers, isn't there? Everybody always says, oh, you know, you'd have to be insane to do this, but when you're in a bunch of guys, you don't want to be one to be seen to be, you know, it's all stiff British upper lip, you know, you don't want to be letting the side down, and you don't want to be the one who steps out and suddenly goes, no, I'm not doing that, because you'd get labelled as LMF. Obviously nowadays it'd be like PTSD or something, but it wasn't understood then. So, yeah, the mindsets are different, and this is where it comes in with me reading all this material and that, because, you know, obviously I've not done it, you know, but, you know, if you watch those films and you see it, and there's a whole different, not aura to the period, but, you know, it's all about, you know, fighting for king and country, and we're protecting ourselves, and the Nazis have to be beaten, and all that, and that sort of like overrides the, I might die tomorrow, the plane might fall out of the sky, I might get shot down, I might get blown up, I might, you know, those are things, but those, it's sort of like you file it away in the very much with pilots, it seems to fall into the category of, oh, it'll never happen to me, it'll happen to the other guy, because, you know, I'm too good, and all this, and what I sort of find with my reading is, yeah, actually, no, it's not. You could be the best guy on the squadron, but if you happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, you know, curtains. But, you know, they didn't think like that, you know, because, to be fair, if you did start thinking like that, then you probably wouldn't have been fit for operations anyway, because you would start getting very twitchy about what you were being asked to do, and then you might not necessarily do it, because obviously if you don't commit to it, then you become hesitant, and then you miss the chance, and then something happens to you. So, yeah, I think it's the kind of thing that comes from the more research you do, you sort of slot into that whole perspective on things to sort of get where they're coming from.
Yes, it's perhaps ignorance is bliss, as you say.
Yeah,
They really
yeah.
didn't know what the possibilities were.
It could possibly be, adrenaline as well, and people get addicted to adrenaline.
Oh yeah, I mean, there's plenty of instances where you sort of see the thing where there's that one guy who loved what he does, and he's a real sort of killer type. The moral aspect of bombing a bunch of defenseless civilians doesn't enter into his head because, I'm killing Germans and that's what I'm to do, So there's always, there's an American book called The War Lover, which actually was made into a film with Steve McQueen and Robert Wagner. And again, that was very much, as much as it was about daylight bombing and being on part of an American bomber crew, at the back of it was the fact that the main pilot, which is the Steve McQueen character, really loved war. He was, as the title says, he was a war lover, and it wasn't him trying to get with girls. It was he liked killing, and the rest of the crew were along for the ride because he's the pilot, and they're having to deal with this guy. So again, it was a very interesting psychological study, basically, of he's doing it because he wants to kill. He's doing it because, well, I thought it'd be fun, and he's rapidly disabused of the notion. So that certainly is an aspect.
Sorry, there's just a question from me. Yes, Susanna.
Do you use some historical facts in your books, for instance, from input from church leaders and how on all the things that were going on that are actually facts? Do you weave that into the story? Do you use that?
The question is about how much historical fact is actually put into the story.
Short answer, yes. Long answer, it depends on the book. Maximum effort, every single raid that the crew go on was an actual raid that actually happened. So I was very heavily dependent upon the Bomber Command War Diaries, the night raid reports, and a lot of other stuff. So as much as it was fiction, because it was the adventure of that crew, the fact that it was raining that night, yeah, it was, because I know it was, because I've got the material. The latest book, which I'm writing now, is going to finish with them flying cover for the Dieppe landing. So I'm going to have to do quite a bit of reading about that, because how the landing progressed and it all went wrong and everything is going to be a big feature of the book. But again, for Demons in the Dark, obviously we've all heard the fairy tale, carrots help you see in the dark. Yeah, well, that all came out of the early radar war, because they realized if we've got radar and we start shooting the Germans out of the sky in increasing numbers, they're going to smell a rat. And it's like, how could we explain this? Because we couldn't suddenly go, oh yeah, we've got radar, because we don't want to tell the Germans. So some bright spark at the Air Ministry came up with the idea, carrots help you see in the dark. If you eat lots of carrots, you can see in the dark. And this is where the legend of Cat's Eyes Cunningham comes from, who was one of the night fighter aces. Oh yeah, he shot loads of Germans down because he eats loads of carrots. Yeah. So we have a scene where we cut away to the Air Ministry, where they're all coming up with this cunning wheeze and discussing back and forth about how it happens. And again, it depends on the story, because as much as sometimes our guys are involved in what's going on, I sometimes break away on a chapter to sort of have a more overarching overview of what's going on at that point, or at a much higher level, where like some sort of decisions made, because then those events impact on what's going to happen later. So how I weave it in varies, but yeah, there's a lot of stuff, like even the breakaway, the guys might all be gathered around the radio when one of the really famous Churchill speeches come in, and then they all start bashing church, and then, oh yeah, what a load of cobblers and all this. But it's, you weave it in, and again, it's all stuff that contributes to giving you that period detail and the world building.
Yeah.
I wanted to know if there are any women in your books at all.
The question is about the women in the books.
Okay, there are some. Obviously it's difficult, because I try to avoid the cliche of it's, oh, she's a nurse or she's a WAF. But I'm a bit limited, because obviously women were not in combat roles in Western forces. In Channel Dash, one of the female characters is an ATA pilot. So she's ferrying planes around to the squadrons, and of course she gets grief because it's like, oh, yeah, women flying planes, and she gives them what for, you know. Very often it's a WAF. I think in one book she's a Wren. You can see I'm struggling, you know. In the book in Korea, one of the main female characters is going to be a war correspondent for Life magazines. That gives me something different. I can come up with this really strong female character who's very independent and doesn't take any nonsense from you lot, because I see stuff you've not seen, you know. In the latest book, she's a factory worker. As I was speaking before we started, about 10 years ago, I actually part wrote, and I doubt this book will ever see the light of day. I did about 150 pages on the RAF serving in Russia, in the northern campaign, where we had ferried aircraft to supply the Russians. And it's great, but bearing in mind current world events, I don't think it will see the light of day, which is a shame, because the Russians actually had female combat units. And there was this great scene, it's all planned out, where our guys are going to get the fat pulled out of the fire by some Russian fighter planes, and they're going to get back, and it'll be like, I say thanks very much. And the pilot jumps down, takes the helmet off, and it's a woman. And they're all going to be like, oh, it's a woman, you know, and their male ego is going to be bruised. But, you know, because like, my God, you know, God, it's a woman. You know, because they did have some aces, Lily Litvak, the White Rose of Stalingrad, and others. And now I'm going to be rather stuck, because until current events change, I don't think anybody's going to be much interested in reading about the RAF fighting heroically alongside the Russians. So that one might have to take a back seat for a while. So I do what I can. I'm afraid it does rather conform sometimes to the sort of traditional model where they are the love interest. But I try to mix it up a bit, so there's a bit of variety.
Can I just ask a question about research, because we covered it quite a bit. I've read a number of your books, and they are good action novels, but what I found with a lot of other action authors is that when they start putting facts in, you start wondering whether, one, they're saying, look at me, how clever I am, and two, do they realise that all this factual information could be slowing down the base of the book? Now, I know, I mean, your Demons in Dark, for example, is about the development of radar, and it's very, very interesting, but it doesn't get to never gets to the point where you think, oh my God, move on, you know.
Right. Yeah.
It's everything you need to know, but then back into the action. Now, the question is, from the concept of the book to the time we got the completed novel, roughly what sort of percentage of the time do you spend on research?
Ooh. Varies. That one obviously had to be quite a bit, because there was a lot of technical stuff with the radar that I had to get right. You wouldn't believe the messages I get sometimes. Oh, that never happened. Yeah, I know it didn't happen. It's fiction. The thing with the books particularly is I always try to find a little area of war that's perhaps maybe is not as well trod. So I've got the room to mess with the actual historical events. So the main historical event still happens, but I've just got this little opening on the side where I can slide in with my little bit. So, you know, none of my books are ever going to change world history. That's not the point of it. As I said before, it's always about to give you that flavour of that moment. But I think when I'm writing, it's always better to have too much than have not enough, because when you come to the editing phase, it's much easier to strip things out than be sat there going like, oh God, I've got to explain this better, and you've got to suddenly come up with a more detailed way of doing it. But again, funny enough, you touched on something we were talking about beforehand. My sort of rule of thumb is it can't interfere with the narrative. It can't interfere with the narrative flow. So if we're building towards the climax, if I've got to suddenly stop to explain something, then I've done something wrong. What I've got to look now is how do I get that piece of information? Firstly, is it important? Do I have to have it? And if I do have to have it, I've got to find some way of slotting that in early, because I should be explaining that stuff earlier, not right at the point where we're wanting to get to the good stuff. Yeah. Again, the other rule of thumb is if it's more than a couple of paragraphs or at most a page, that's too much. Because if you really, really want to go and find out about this stuff, go and read a book. You know, this is fiction. I'm not here to give you the nitty-gritty educational bit about that. It's here to entertain. So I always try to strike the balance of there's enough there to give you the flavour, and the technical details that have to be absolutely right. Like sometimes talking about angles of attack and stuff for a particular weapon, or the detection ranges of the radar, because those are important elements to the story. But once I've explained that, I'm not going to keep on repeating and banging that drum, because I've done that. So yeah, it is difficult. Percentage of research to the writing, probably I very much fall in the realm of it's more important to get the research done first, because if I've got the understanding of it, I know then how I can sort of break it down and explain it in a more simplified form for the reader, and I know which bits I don't need to put in. If I don't understand it, I'm at risk of if I just repeat it word for word, okay, fine, it might be right, but is it servicing the story? And really that's the important thing. Does it serve the story? If it doesn't, it's not going in. Yeah.
Well, I think you'll agree with me. We had a fascinating afternoon. Yes. I would encourage you to come and talk to Vince yourselves. Come and look at his books if you want to know any more about them. But thank you very much indeed, Vince. That has been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please let